The night I turned 18, nobody called. Not my mother. Not the caseworker who had handled my file for 3 years. Not the group home supervisor who had smiled at me 2 weeks earlier and said, "You'll be fine, Marcus. You're one of the smart ones." Nobody called. I sat on the edge of a sidewalk in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina, with a black garbage bag between my knees. Everything I owned was inside it: 2 pairs of jeans, some socks, a worn-out copy of The Alchemist that a teacher had given me in 9th grade, and a photograph of a woman I barely remembered. My mother, from before things got bad. The group home had a policy. 18 meant out. It didn't matter that it was November. It didn't matter that I had nowhere to go. Policy was policy, and policy didn't feel the cold the way I did. I watched a couple walk past me, laughing, carrying paper bags from a restaurant. The smell of garlic and warm bread followed them like a ghost. My stomach made a sound I pretended not to hear. I opened The Alchemist to a random page in the darkness, the way I'd always done when I needed something to hold on to. My fingers found a line I'd underlined years ago. When you want something, all the universe conspires in helping you to achieve it. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I closed the book, pulled the garbage bag closer, and tried to figure out where a person sleeps when they have no address, no family, and $18.40 to their name. That was the night everything began. I just didn't know it yet. There's a particular kind of loneliness that only exists in cities. Not the quiet loneliness of empty fields or silent rooms. This kind is loud. It surrounds you with proof that the world is continuing without you. Traffic moves. Music plays from open windows. People argue, laugh, kiss, complain. And you sit in the middle of all of it, completely invisible. I learned invisibility fast. The first 3 weeks, I slept in places I'm still not entirely comfortable describing. A church doorway that was unlocked until a deacon discovered me at 5 a.m. and told me to leave without making eye contact. A laundromat where the overnight warmth from the dryers kept you from shivering, until management caught on and installed a sensor alarm. The back booth of a 24-hour diner where a waitress named Dottie would let me nurse a $2 coffee for 4 hours before her shift manager made her say something. Dottie was the first person in weeks who looked at me like I was a person. "You got family around here?" she asked one morning, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs toward me without charging. It was 4 a.m. and the diner was empty. "No, ma'am." She studied me for a moment. "You eating enough?" I didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She nodded slowly. "Come back tomorrow. Early." That was the extent of it, but something about that small gesture, eggs on a plate, no receipt, no lecture, cracked something open inside me that I hadn't known was sealed shut. I had been operating in pure survival mode, which means you compress everything. You don't think about the future. You don't think about the past. You think about tonight, and maybe the next 6 hours, and that's the ceiling of your imagination. The eggs reminded me that imagination could stretch further than that. But the streets had their own lessons, and they weren't gentle. I tried to get work. Without a permanent address, applications went nowhere. Without a phone, mine had died in week 2 with no way to charge it. Follow-up calls were impossible. I stood outside a construction site on Morrison Street for 4 mornings straight, hoping the foreman might need a day laborer. On the 4th morning, he finally walked over to me. "You 18?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Got ID?" I showed him my state ID. He looked at it, looked at me, handed it back. "Come back when you got boots," he said. "Can't have you on site in sneakers. Liability." I looked down at my shoes. They were falling apart at the seams. I hadn't noticed until that moment how clearly they announced everything about me. That night, sitting behind a convenience store with 2 gas station hot dogs and a warmth that was already failing me by 8 p.m., I felt something I had been fighting for weeks finally arrive. Despair. Not sadness. Despair is different. Sadness is weather. Despair is geology, it settles into the ground beneath you, and suddenly the ground itself feels unreliable. I sat there with grease on my fingers, and I thought, maybe this is just what my life is. Maybe this is the ceiling. The thought didn't come with drama. It came quietly, which made it worse. It was around that time that I started spending my days along the old rail corridor south of downtown. Most people didn't go there. The city had decommissioned the track in the early 2000s and there were half-hearted plans for a greenway project that had stalled somewhere in committee. Until then, it was just weeds, broken bottles, graffiti, and a long row of rusted freight cars that hadn't moved in probably 15 years. I went there because it was quiet. Because nobody looked at me like a problem to be solved or a liability to be avoided. I went there to breathe. The train cars had been there so long that the earth seemed to be slowly claiming them. Vines curled through wheel spokes. Rust had turned the steel into something almost organic, textured, layered, almost warm-looking in the afternoon light, like tree bark or coral. Each car sat slightly tilted on the neglected rails, some with their sliding doors frozen halfway open, some sealed shut. I walked the row most afternoons. 12 cars total. I had named them in my head, not romantically, just practically, to track which ones had shelter value and which ones were too compromised. Car 7 was my favorite spot to sit and think. Its door was halfway open on the west side, giving you a view of the sky through the gap in a way that felt almost architectural. One Tuesday in early December, I was walking the row when I noticed something I had somehow missed in 3 weeks of daily visits. Car 3's door was different. It had been sealed shut like the others, I was certain of that, the rust pattern had been continuous, unbroken. But now there was a gap. Not wide, maybe 8 inches. The kind of gap that could mean weather damage, vandalism, or simple coincidence. I stood in front of it for a long moment. In the world I came from, foster care, group homes, streets, you learn to read situations for threat before anything else. Unknown space. Unknown content. Unknown ownership. All of those registered as risk. But the afternoon light was hitting that gap in a strange way. Dusty and golden. And there was something coming from inside, not a smell exactly, more like an absence of the outside smell. A different quality of air. I shouldn't have gone in. I want to be honest about that. Not because of danger, as it turned out, but because I was operating on borrowed time and every decision carried weight it wouldn't carry for someone with a safety net. Curiosity was a luxury I'd been suppressing for months. But I went in anyway. The interior of Car 3 was dim but not completely dark, light came through rusted holes in the roof like scattered spotlights, the way light moves through cathedral windows in old films. The floor was littered with debris. Old insulation material. A rusted chain coiled in one corner. Some newspapers that had dissolved into something closer to texture than paper. And then, in the far left corner, stacked against the wall and partially covered by what looked like an old tarpaulin so decayed it had merged with the things beneath it, shelves. Rough wooden shelves, homemade. Someone had bolted supports into the freight car's interior walls with real precision. 6 shelves, floor to ceiling, and on them, books. Not a few books. Not a scattered handful. Hundreds of books. I stood there in the dusty golden light, genuinely unable to process what I was seeing. My brain kept trying to categorize it, storage unit, donation cache, some eccentric's abandoned project, but nothing fully fit. The books were wrapped, each one individually, in what appeared to be wax paper. Some had deteriorated, but the wax paper had protected many of them. I reached for one carefully, unwrapped a corner. The complete works of Ralph Waldo Emerson. I reached for another. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Another. Walden by Henry David Thoreau. More, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. James Baldwin. Toni Morrison. Dostoevsky. Langston Hughes. Mary Oliver. There were notebooks too. Composition books, the black and white marble kind, stacked in a separate section. And beneath the lowest shelf, a metal tin that had once held cookies, now containing something else. Inside the tin, a folded letter, a carpenter's pencil, and a compass, the navigational kind, brass, heavy, old. I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was careful. Old-fashioned. The paper had yellowed but was legible, preserved by the same wax paper logic as the books. It read, "If you found this, you needed to find it." That's how it works. I spent 30 years understanding that the only real poverty is not knowing who you are. These books taught me. I'm leaving them here because libraries have hours, and sometimes the people who need books most can't wait for library hours. Take what you need. Leave something if you can, a thought, a page, an idea. The pencil is for you. The compass is for you. You're not lost. You just haven't started navigating yet. It was unsigned. I sat down on the floor of that freight car, in the cold and the dust and the scattered cathedral light, and I read that letter 4 more times. Then I opened Man's Search for Meaning to the first page, and I didn't move for 2 hours. I want to tell you that finding those books changed everything immediately. That I read one chapter and was filled with clarity and purpose. That would be the cleaner version of this story. The truth is messier and slower and more honest. I started sleeping in car 3. Not because it was significantly warmer, it wasn't, but because I could read by day and the books felt like company in a way I couldn't fully articulate. I kept my garbage bag in the far corner. I draped the old tarpaulin over me at night, supplemented by layers of clothing donated from a church pantry on Sundays. The first book I finished was Viktor Frankl. I read it in 3 days. It wrecked me. Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, and his book was about finding meaning in suffering. Not eliminating suffering, finding meaning within it. He wrote about how everything could be taken from a person except the ability to choose their response to their circumstances. I read that passage and put the book down and stared at the rusted ceiling for a long time. I had been telling myself a story. The story was, the world did this to me, the system did this to me, and therefore I am waiting for the world or the system to fix it. It was a true story in many ways. I had been failed, genuinely, repeatedly, by people and institutions that should have done better. That part was real. But Frankl, who had been in Auschwitz, Frankl was telling me something uncomfortable. That the story wasn't finished. That authorship wasn't entirely gone. I started using the composition books. At first just to copy out passages that hit me hard. Then to write responses, arguments, sometimes, disagreements, because Frankl was writing from a context so extreme that it felt presumptuous to apply it too directly to my situation. But the practice of writing, of putting thought into language, started doing something to my brain. It slowed the noise down. Still, the cold was real. The hunger was real. The books didn't fix any of that. I got a day job washing dishes at a restaurant called Pino's on Fayetteville Street, found through a bulletin board at the church pantry. No application required, cash at the end of each shift, no questions about an address. The owner, a compact man named Gerald who always wore the same Wolfpack cap, paid $12 an hour and let me eat whatever the kitchen had left at the end of service. The work was brutal in its own way. Standing for 8 hours, hands in hot water until the skin cracked, the relentless noise of a kitchen during dinner service. But I started to understand something about work that I hadn't before. Not that it was dignified or ennobling in some abstract sense, but that it was mine. My hours, my labor, my $12. I saved aggressively. spent almost nothing. After 6 weeks, I had enough for a prepaid phone. After another 4, I had enough for a deposit on a room in a boarding house on Cabarrus Street, a single room with a shared bathroom, $380 a month. The kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear every conversation in every room, where someone cooked fish at midnight and the smell colonized everything. It was the most beautiful room I had ever had. But here's where I need to be honest about the hard part. Getting the room didn't change the internal weather. The despair I had felt behind the convenience store hadn't fully left, it had just gotten quieter. Some nights I would sit on the edge of the bed in that small room, and the question would surface again, the geological one: what is this building toward? What am I actually doing? I had started taking books from Car 3, reading them in my room, returning them and taking others. I'd read Emerson's Self-Reliance, Marcus Aurelius, Langston Hughes, Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Each one left marks. But reading and knowing and actually becoming are 3 different distances apart, and I kept confusing them. I signed up for a GED prep course at the community center. I had dropped out in 11th grade when my 3rd foster placement collapsed. The course met on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and the instructor was a retired teacher named Mr. Okonkwo, who had the patience of someone who had given up being surprised by anything. "You understand this material," he told me after the 3rd session. "You're not struggling with the content. You're struggling to believe you're allowed to be here." I didn't argue with him. He was right, and I knew it, and knowing it didn't immediately fix it. That's the gap people don't talk about enough, the space between understanding something and integrating it. I failed the math section of the practice GED twice. Not because I couldn't do the math, I could. I failed because I would reach a certain point in the exam and something would close down inside me, some internal switch, and I'd start making errors I knew were errors even while I was making them. Mr. Okonkwo had a word for it: self-sabotage. I had a different word for it: habit. 18 years of being told, explicitly or implicitly, that you are the kind of person things don't work out for, that becomes habit. And habits live in the body, not the brain, which is why knowing better isn't always enough. I went back to Car 3 during that period more than usual. Sat in the familiar light. Read. Wrote in the composition books. Sometimes I'd sit with the brass compass in my hand, not using it, just holding it. Feeling its weight. The mystery of the person who left it there never left me. 5 months after I found Car 3. On a Thursday in late April, when the weather had finally shifted into something merciful and the trees along the rail corridor were full of the first green of spring, I passed the GED. Not just passed. Scored in the 87th percentile overall. 94th in reading and language arts. Mr. Okonkwo shook my hand with both of his. "Now," he said, "what are you going to do with it?" I had been thinking about that question for weeks, and the answer I'd arrived at wasn't the one I expected. During all those months of reading in Car 3, Emerson, Frankl, Thoreau, Hughes, Baldwin, Mary Oliver, a pattern had started to emerge that I couldn't ignore. Not a pattern in the books, but in the composition notebooks I'd been filling. I'd been writing, essentially, without fully acknowledging it. Responses, observations, personal essays that started as reactions to what I was reading and gradually became something else. Something that was recognizably mine. A voice I didn't know I had. At the church where I attended the Sunday pantry, the pastor had started a small community bulletin. Printed on regular paper, stapled, left in the lobby. Local news, community announcements, occasional short essays. I had read it for months. One Sunday, I asked the pastor if I could submit something. He looked at me, not with suspicion, but with the particular attention of someone recalibrating their assessment. "Write it," he said, "and we'll see." I wrote a piece about the rail corridor. About the freight cars and the weeds and the way the afternoon light moved through the rusted gaps. I didn't mention the books. Not yet. I wrote about what it meant to find beauty in a place the city had decided was finished. I wrote about how places, like people, sometimes need someone to look at them long enough to see what they actually contain. 2 weeks later, a woman named Priya stopped me after the Sunday service. She was a journalism instructor at Wake Technical Community College. She had the community bulletin folded in her hand. "Did you write this piece about the rail corridor?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Where did you study writing?" "I thought about Car 3. About the wax paper-wrapped books. About a nameless person who had believed that the people who need books most can't always wait for library hours." "Self-taught," I said. She handed me a card. "We have a scholarship program for non-traditional students. Your writing has a quality I don't see in many of my enrolled students. Come talk to me." I turned the card over in my hand. It was a small rectangle of paper, but it had the density of something much heavier. This was not luck. I want to be clear about that. Luck would have been finding the books and immediately flourishing. What actually happened was 5 months of reading, writing, failing, adjusting, persisting, and slowly building something that could be recognized. Priya recognized it because I had built something real to recognize. The turning point wasn't one moment. It was the accumulation of all the unremarkable moments that preceded it, finally reaching a kind of critical mass. I enrolled at Wake Tech in the fall semester. Journalism and media communications. Priya's scholarship covered tuition and materials. I was still working at Pino's, still in the Kabara street room, but the shape of my days had changed entirely. College was not what I imagined. It was harder, in some ways, and stranger. I was in classes with people who had safety nets I still didn't have, people who could call home when they were overwhelmed, people whose worst-case scenario was moving back to a family house. I didn't resent them for it. I had spent enough time around resentment to understand it as a kind of weight you carry for someone else's benefit. But there were also people like me. More than I expected. People who had found their way to this particular room through crooked paths. We recognized each other without always talking about it. There was a woman named Destiny in my morning writing seminar who wrote with a ferocity that came from somewhere difficult. A man named Terrence in media ethics who was in his late 30s, who had spent 7 years incarcerated and was rebuilding on the other side of it with a steadiness I found genuinely inspiring. We weren't a support group. We were just people who showed up and worked. I worked differently than I had in the GED course. Not because college material was easier, in some ways it was much harder, but because something had shifted in the architecture of how I understood myself. The self-sabotage pattern hadn't disappeared, but I had gotten better at recognizing it. The internal switch that used to close down in high-pressure moments, I could feel it now when it was about to trip. And sometimes, not always, I could make a different choice in that fraction of a second. I kept going back to Car 3. Even after I had more access to books, the college library, public library, I kept returning to the freight car. Not just for the books, though I was still reading from the collection there. For the space itself. For what it represented. In one of the composition notebooks, I had started keeping something like a record. Not a diary, more of an ongoing conversation with the unnamed person who had built those shelves and left those books. I wrote as if addressing them directly. You left Marcus Aurelius. I understand why now. I resisted it at first, the emperor thing felt distant, but the line about obstacles became my line. The obstacle is the way. I don't fully believe it yet, but I'm practicing believing it. That writing practice, which had started in desperation and continued out of discipline, became the foundation of my best academic work. Priya told me once that my essays had an unusual quality: they read like someone who was genuinely working something out on the page, rather than performing understanding they already had. That's rare, she said. Most people write to demonstrate. You write to discover. Don't lose that. The consequences of growth aren't always comfortable. I want to include that. As I changed, the boarding house on Cabarrus Street started to feel different. Not worse, exactly, but smaller. Some of the people there, people I'd eaten with, talked to through thin walls, weren't changing the way I was, and I felt the distance growing. And feeling that distance made me uncomfortable with myself. Growth can feel like betrayal when it's happening in only one direction. There were nights I would lie awake wondering if I was becoming someone who thought they were better than where they came from. That thought scared me more than anything. I did not want to be that person. I had known people who had escaped difficult circumstances and then treated those circumstances, and the people still in them, as proof of their own superiority. I found it grotesque. So I stayed on Cabarrus Street longer than was necessary. Not as penance, but as a practice of remembering. And when I finally moved, to a small apartment near campus, shared with 2 other students, real furniture, a proper bed, I took one composition notebook from Car 3 with me. The first one. The one where I'd copied out the Viktor Frankl passage and argued with it in the margins. It sat on my desk like a compass. In my second year at Wake Tech, I wrote a long feature piece for the college newspaper about the rail corridor. The project had been Priya's suggestion. She thought the environment piece I'd written for the church bulletin had more to say. I spent 2 months reporting it. Talked to city planners, historians, people who remembered when the corridor was active. Photographed the freight cars in different light, different seasons. And then I went looking for who had left the books. I didn't expect to find anything. A collection of books in an abandoned train car, a handwritten note, a brass compass. These felt like relics of a person who might not be alive, or who might have left no traceable footprint. But I'm a journalist by training now, which means I believe in the trail even when I can't see it yet. At the Historical Society, I found records of the railway company that had operated the corridor. Freight manifests, employee records, maintenance logs going back decades. Cross-referencing dates on the newspapers I'd found in Car 3 with railway operation records gave me a rough window. The books had likely been placed there sometime between 2004 and 2008. After the line was decommissioned. At the public library's local history section, with the help of a librarian who had the energy of someone who lived for exactly this kind of request, I found a small item in a 2009 issue of a local neighborhood newsletter. A man named Calvin Whitmore, described as a longtime railway employee and self-educated reader, had passed away that year. The item mentioned that he had often spoken about the importance of books to people who might not have access to them. It mentioned, without specifics, that he had arranged something in the rail corridor before he died. Calvin Whitmore. 71 years old. Spent 42 years working the railways. Never went to college. Taught himself through books, borrowed, bought second-hand, accumulated over a lifetime. A man who understood that formal education was not the only door into the life of the mind, and who had quietly, without fanfare or attribution, tried to leave another door open. The compass made sense now. Railway workers used compasses. It wasn't a symbol he had chosen for its metaphorical weight, it was an object from his working life, something that had oriented him, that he had left for whoever came next. I sat with this information for a long time. Calvin Whitmore had never met me. Had never known my name, my story, or that I would spend a November night on a Raleigh sidewalk and eventually find my way to his freight car. He had acted in the faith that someone would find those books who needed to find them. Not me specifically. Anyone. The need was the qualification. There's a version of my story where I say, a mysterious stranger saved my life. That version is satisfying but incomplete. Calvin Whitmore didn't save my life. He left something in the world that I encountered at the exact moment I was capable of receiving it. What happened after that encounter, the reading, the writing, the failing, the persisting, the GED, the scholarship, the journalism, that was mine. But here's what I keep returning to, the thing I can't reduce to a simple lesson. Calvin Whitmore had spent his life working a job the world considered ordinary, and he had built, quietly and without recognition, a library in a rusted train car that he never expected anyone to know was his. He died without knowing if a single person had ever found it. He released his gift into uncertainty and trusted the uncertainty. I think about that when I'm afraid to put something into the world without knowing how it will land. I think about that when I'm tempted to make my giving conditional on acknowledgement. The feature piece I wrote ran in the college newspaper and was picked up by the city paper. It included what I had found about Calvin Whitmore. His story reached his surviving family, a daughter in Greensboro who called the newspaper and left a message for me. We met for coffee. Her name was Denise. She was in her late 50s, a school librarian, and when I told her what her father's books had meant to me, she held the coffee cup with both hands and looked out the window for a moment before speaking. He used to say that a book is a conversation that can travel through time, she said. He kept sending messages. I didn't know he was still doing it that late. She gave me his compass back. I had returned it to car 3 after I'd taken it. She said her father would have wanted the person who found it to keep it. I have it on my desk now, next to the composition notebook. I am 23 years old as I tell you this story. I have an associate's degree in journalism. I have a byline in a publication that people actually read. I have a room that belongs to me, a window that gets morning light, and enough in my account that the end of the month doesn't feel like a cliff edge. But none of those things are the real ending. The real ending, or the real beginning, depending on how you orient yourself, is a practice. It's the act of going back to the composition notebook every morning. Of reading carefully. Of writing honestly. Of treating my own observations as worth investigating rather than dismissing. It's the act of believing, on the days when it's hard to believe, that the obstacle is still the way. Calvin Whitmore worked a railroad for 42 years and taught himself everything through books, and at the end of his life he built a library in a rusted freight car and left it for a stranger. He didn't know my name. He didn't need to. He understood something I am still learning: generosity is most powerful when it expects nothing back. And survival, real survival, the kind that doesn't just mean staying alive but means building something worth living, isn't a singular event. It's a series of small choices made in the dark, when you're cold, when you're afraid, when the voice underneath everything is telling you that the ceiling is low and fixed and has always been fixed. The night I turned 18, nobody called. I sat on a sidewalk and read The Alchemist by streetlight and didn't know that the universe was already conspiring, in the slow, unglamorous, non-cinematic way that universes actually operate. A man I would never meet had already prepared something for me. And I would have to find it myself. That's always how it works. So I want to leave you with this question, not a rhetorical one, but a real one, the kind worth sitting with. Somewhere in your life right now, there may be a rusted train car you keep walking past. Something that looks like debris, like ruin, like a place the world has finished with. What would happen if, just once, you pushed against the door? For Calvin Whitmore. The man who left the lights on.